for some time. It's with the wonderful Mr. Otto Scharmer. Otto, firstly, welcome to World Unity Week. It's so great to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And let me just read a little bit here from about you, because you have such a long history of incredible work. Today, we're going to be talking about the decade of transformation from vision to reality with Otto Scharmer. Many of you will know, of course, Otto Scharmer is senior lecturer at MIT and co-founder of the Presencing Institute. He chairs the MIT Ideas Program for cross-sector innovation and introduced the concept of presencing, learning from the emerging future. Wow, that sounds very appropriate and relevant for us here in World Unity Week, Otto. He is the author and co-author of the books Theory U, Presence, and the Essentials of Theory U. In 2015, Otto co-founded the MIT XU Lab and the GAIA Journey, Global Activation of Intention and Action, both of which promote a worldwide ecosystem of transformational change. Most recently, he and his colleagues co-hosted the United Nations Global Dialogues on Transforming Systems and co-created the Action Learning Lab and numerous SDG leadership labs. Well, let's start with the SDGs, because we're here to talk about this decade of transformation. And it's interesting, Otto, because earlier today we had spiritual leader from The Hague in Holland, Rabbi Avraham Sotendorp, who's connected to a lot of different boards around the world. And he is wanting to look at these 2020s to declare a holy decade, to animate the if you like, the faith-based traditions around this year. Then you've got the SDGs, which are the, if you like, the secular metrics about what we need to do to turn it around. And then it seems that this decade of transformation that you're proposing and are going to be sharing with us today really holds a whole of this together. But it's unmistakable that this decade of the 2020s is orientating so many change makers, so many institutions, so many organizations and visionaries. And it really does seem like it's now or never. So having you with us here in World Unity Week is a great blessing. And I would love just to ask you, what does it mean to you, this decade of transformation? What does that mean to you, Otto Scharmer?
Well, maybe so. Thanks, Ben. And I really look forward to the conversation with you. And hopefully we'll be also able to turn some of the questions around to draw you out, to learn a little bit about your work and the work of Unity Earth that seems to be so critical, particularly at this point. And I love this notion of the holy decade. I think there might be also, because I think spirituality is at the core of the global movement that we see rising right now. Of course, there's also, it may be also, some may say it's a little bit assuming, right? Because the world religions have been more maybe an obstacle, right, than a helpful force in many cases in history. So a holy decade is pointing in the right direction, but it's also maybe a little more humility, right? And in terms of the condition that often we see, I mean, I think you are also US based, so often we see religion really used. I'm not saying that's what religion is. We see a religion used in a way that's really contrary to the essence, and in a way that is contributing to the problems that we have. And what I really mean with a decade of transformation is something very simple. Which is that when you look at the problems today, there are really three big problems that we have been facing for a while and that have been getting worse every single decade. And one way of framing them is that what we are dealing with is three major divides. So we as a global community face three major divides: the ecological divide, the social divide, and the spiritual divide. And ecological divide is basically arising from a disconnect between self and nature, right? All the environmental issues, we know everything around that. The social divide is the disconnect that we have with each other, right? Between self and other, and all the polarization and all the forms of direct and structural violence, systemic racism, and so on. And the spiritual divide really is arising from a disconnect between self and self, between who I am today and who I could be tomorrow, my highest future possibility. And if those two selves, who I am today, who I could be tomorrow, are not well linked, so if they are not in connection or in resonance with each other, the way it looks like, feels like is burnout, loss of energy, symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, and when it's getting worse, even risk for suicide. So all the huge amplification and magnification of mental health issues over the past months and years, of social polarization and disconnect, really societies. You see it here in the U.S. It's societies falling apart. They're no longer, so we are no longer able to really connect with one another. And also the disconnect to Mother Nature, right, that we see amplifying, and that puts the foundations of our living systems at risk, and that require massive action and transformation, not sometimes in the future, but starting in this decade. That's what I mean with decade of transformation, addressing the three divides, bridging these three divides. And what it really is I think it links with a deep-seated feelings that many people have today in the world. And I already came across that truly before COVID, right? So most people in institutions, in grassroots movements, right? So you would talk to kind of across continents and cultures. Most people today have a fairly clear feeling that our current civilization, the way we run our economies, our societies, and so on, are really hitting the wall. Basically, the whole concept of materialism, if you want. And that people, so including with decision makers in business organizations, in governments, and so on. So when you talk to them privately, they would agree, kind of we are hitting the wall. We needed to do something else, but we are not. So most people then would say, we'll have that awareness. That's not sustainable what we are doing. So we are kind of moving into a period of disruption. Most people would say, I would like to be part of a different story. And most people then would be quick to add, but I don't know how. So I think that's kind of the inner configuration that many, many people have. We are moving in the wrong direction. We are hitting the wall. I want to be part of a different story, but I don't know how. And that's, I think, is a massive opportunity that we face. The movements, the grassroots movements, Fridays for Future, Black Lives Matter, and all the other related movements, they're a small beginning of a much larger uprising that in part, that not only has to do with people taking to the streets, of course that needs to happen as well, but it's also an inner movement. And what I mean with inner movement is shifting the inner place from that we operate, deepening the inner place from where we listen, because at the end, I believe that the bigger shift that's necessary in order to really address the three divides that I mentioned is a shift in consciousness from one mode that is operating based on ecosystem awareness, me, basically kind of looking at everything just from our ego angle, to ecosystem awareness, by which I mean an awareness that is inclusive of all the other perspectives in the ecosystem that I'm dealing with, particularly the perspective and the experience of those that are at the margin, that are most marginalized by the current system. So that's basically what I mean with decade of transformation. It is addressing the three divides by focusing on a transformation that is not only looking at the surface, reacting against the surface problems, but that is really leading to a movement of awareness-based systems change, of shifting the awareness from which we operate, by which I mean a shift from ecosystem awareness to ecosystem awareness. And that is not a theory, it's not wishful thinking, it's something that's already happening in many places, something that's growing bottom up, kind of out of villages, out of cities, out of grassroots movements. And that needs to reach more of the mainstream institutions and can reach more of the mainstream institutions, as we see in our work with the UN institutions, as we see in results like the Paris Agreement, or also the adoption of the SDGs. But what is it, Ben? I mean, just turning it around. So what's your own take on that? So what do you think, kind of this current moment? So what is it really that's at stake, and how would you answer your own question?
Thank you, Otto. Thank you for turning it around. I think you just did a U-turn, right? That's good. But look, I think I welcome the conversation. It does seem clear, very clear, that it's now the time. And we had been at Unity Earth, and our partners, many of whom are here today, the Sign Network and many others, have been on a journey on the road to 2020 through the last decade, really starting in early parts of the 2010s. Now, we had no idea what was going to happen when we got to 2020, Otto, but we were building relationships and connections, and through many different groups, particularly indigenous and faith-based groups and spiritual groups and cultural groups, and building that up all over the planet. And so I think that there are many doorways into this great big tent. Some are coming in through the ecological crisis. Some are coming in through social justice, which you've named some of those emerging movements. Some come in through rising consciousness, or maybe they all have a rising consciousness, which is a kind of a stamp of
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But it seems to me that the urgency now is, how do we connect and empower all these different elements that are rising? It's interesting you talked about the grassroots and the institution, because I was going to you see this happening slow moving in institutions. And, I'm very interested in your work at the UN and at the university and higher learning, and these institutions, which are typically quite slow moving. And then the grassroots, we had Paul Hawken on yesterday. And of course, the millions of groups that are out there that are rising for ecological concerns, for social justice, et cetera, et cetera. But how can we better synergize? How can we better support each other? How can we better resource each other? How can we even know what each other are up to is half the challenge. Just earlier today, we had, based on the work of David Sloan Wilson, the evolutionary biologist, who's really changed the game on how we understand how evolution works at the group selection level. But how many people are actually aware of that information? So I think for us, the challenge to be creative, as my brother John Raymer always says, is how can we better synergize and connect the different aspects in the different fields so that we can all be a part of the solution. I think one thing that's clear is that it's going to take all of us, and it's going to take all of us stepping into our missions and our expertise and our passion areas. But nobody can do it alone, and no organization can do it alone, and no institution can do it alone. So how can we better organize as a whole field? And I think that's something we'd love to explore with you, not only now, but going forward in this conversation, Otto. This decade of transformation, and this event that we're in World Unity Week. I mean, there is an arc to which we are moving, and it is towards greater wholeness, and it is towards a greater unity, and it is towards a greater synergy, which supports all of the parts, and the flow of resources and the flow of what's needed can get to where it needs to go. So in a new model of generosity of spirit rather than dominate and control. But our challenge right now is to do it in the time frame that we have, which most experts will tell us isn't very long. So Otto, how can we better synergize, and how can we better organize, particularly across these vastly different areas, from grassroots organizations all the way through to the United Nations, and faith-based all the way through to secular, and the 10,000 other fields that need to be brought together in unity, harmony, and synergy in order for us to do this work over the coming 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more with everything you said. I also want to loop it back to, I was just listening in to the tail end of the previous conversations. Maybe most of our audience also did, kind of who are joining us now. And so the notion of civil society, right, and civil society kind of the rising movement from civil society as the source of hope and the source of transformation. And uh, I also used to say that, and I'm also still to some degree saying that, but we should be also, of course, acknowledging that what just stuff coming bottom up from civil society doesn't make it always good, right? So look at the Trump movement had quite popular support, still has, right, in this country. And so there are many other examples in other countries as well. So there is also that, which is that just because it's bottom up, that doesn't make it necessarily all good. There's like things where we need to look into the mirror, where we need to challenge our own assumptions, kind of where maybe some of the models we have been operating on have their own blind spots. And that's the hard work we need to do also on the NGO and the grassroots side of things. And in so my life has put me into a place where here at MIT, I have like opportunity to work with many young people, and also, and of course, a lot of my institutional work is happening kind of off campus, but looking at the work with institutions like companies, enterprises, like governments, like multilaterals, like the UN, both here on campus and off campus. Here's when you really get to the deeper levels of change and the deeper levels of what's really what are the deeper sources of inspiration that people carry for their careers, for their work, for their life, for their journeys. I'm always surprised how similar that is. So when you look into the soul of people, it's almost the same, right? From the outside, there's these people in big institutions, right? Kind of it's institution A, B, C, or like the grassroots movement here. It looks like kind of one type of person, totally different type of person from the outside. If you look into the soul, you will be surprised kind of how many shades of gray there are, and how kind of how many similarities you have on the deeper levels of motivation. If you supply these deeper reflection tools, these deeper learning environments. So that's just a point of observation that made me maybe less judgmental, right? That made me maybe more hopeful that there can be also a lot of change happening from inside the big institutions, particularly if bigger institutions, and there's not a single one on earth today that does not, if they face massive challenges of disruption. So everyone does that. So everyone has to go through this phase of stopping and letting go and letting come, and kind of tuning into whatever kind of that next phase is. So when so these two observations, which is not everything that comes bottom up grassroots society is necessarily good. So we need to really qualify that. Mm-hmm. And also not everything what's like inside these big institutions is necessarily bad. Right. So what that tells me is that we need, between the two things that you mentioned, kind of the world unity, kind of, so there's kind of the unity in awareness and consciousness, and the kind of the grassroots movement. Those are the many kind of that are rising bottom up. Those are definitely key points, but there must be something in between. And the something is in between is the transformation of society, the transformation of our key societal sectors that, if unchanged, will just keep producing the same results. And that's really what I mean with decade of transformation. And I mean, in particular, three transformations that are already well underway and that often are underemphasized. The first transformation, of course, is the transformation of our economy, right? Everyone knows that. It's basically a transformation from rethinking the essence of economics from an ecosystem awareness, which is kind of current economic theory, to an ecosystem awareness that is inclusive, right? And that is focusing on the well-being of all. So that's the first transformation. The second transformation. So, and when you and you can look at all the plans, right? So, how do we realize the SDGs? What are the massive changes for decarbonize our economy, right? So, to the shift, the massive shift towards regenerative energy, regenerative agriculture, sustainable mobility, and so on and so forth. And none of that is going to happen without a transformation of our political system, without advancing our democracy from a current state that is often significantly driven by dark money and by big data companies, by a communication structure that is by trillion-dollar companies that have based their business model on amplifying anger, hate, and fear. So that's a problem we have, right? We need to talk about that.
That's a big one, yes.
If we are not addressing that, we are really kind of kidding ourselves, right? We are not really addressing the situation that we face. That's the second one, right? It's the transformation. What I mean with transformation of economy is not only restoring economy, right? Kind of reducing the influence of dark money and so forth. That's a first step, but really also making democracy more distributed, right? Kind of moving more of the decision-making to the people that are really affected by things, more dialogic. And what I mean with dialogue is making a system see itself. It's not just your view, my view, but really kind of inquiring into the root issues of things. And more direct, right? So that we have, because in most democracies, the population has much more educated views, right, on inclusion, right, and on sustainability than the outcomes of the current political decision making because of the power of the vested interest groups. So that's like the second piece, right? So in order to transform the economy, that massive shift is not going to happen without advancing our democracies. And none of these two things, right, that I just mentioned is going to happen without the third transformation. And the third transformation is the transformation of our learning and leadership structures. From the current ways of operating, when you look at education, right, it's basically like head-centric ways of, accumulating knowledge and testing it with outdated methodologies usually, towards a learning and leadership model that is whole person and whole system. What I mean with whole person is integrating head, heart, and hand. And what I mean with whole system is really not only looking at the individual, right, in isolation, but really in a connection with community and really kind of supporting the learner, putting the learner into the driver's seat of transformation and change. Because the generation that has the strongest interest in the current transformation are not the old people that often block, right, change from happening. Look at Brexit, right, over in Europe, kind of who voted for that. It's the young people, right, so whose interests are most aligned with the future of the planet, kind of with the future of multiculturalism, with the future of thriving together rather than excluding each other. So that's that's the third one. So and the third one really at the core. When you look at well, there are good schools here and there and so on. I'm not saying that's not existing, but what I am saying is generally there's a huge blind spot in the current educational system. It's true for all higher education, all universities. It's true for all the schools. What is the
Hmm.
blind spot? The blind spot is transformation literacy. So our current schools do not teach what's most important in this century. So we just, establish that, what needs to happen, both from an inner point of view, but also from an outer point of view, is massive transformation. No one is challenging that, right? Massive transformation needs to happen. But what's missing is transformation literacy, by which I mean the capacity to hold this transformation in a way that is actualizing and catalyzing positive potential rather than catapulting us back into the past, right? As we have seen in other places, right? I mean, I'm born and raised in Germany, right? As we saw in Germany, right, when it came to the 1930s. So that happens much more quickly than you think. And so we are kind of in this very open situation where what will happen in the future is a function of how we show up in our life, in our work today, in this year, in this decade.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Otto. So the first one was transformation of economics. Second one was the transformation of politics. The third one was learning and leadership. And the fourth one, Otto?
No, those are the three. I
The
think
three,
those
the
are
three, the, the three
the three
fields.
major one. And the first one is really economics and the economy, right? Because
Yeah,
it's not just, we don't just need a new textbook, right? We
yeah.
need kind of new capacities. We need to redesign our core economic institutions like money, right? We need to reinvent our thinking about income. So, for example, the whole concept of universal basic income is challenging the way we think about work, right? So we need to some degree a decoupling of work and income so that we can connect with our life's work, really with our capital W work, which is the work that is connected with our true purpose in life, right? What we are here for on earth. We
Yeah.
need to reinvent the whole tax system. I think there's like in all these, we need to rethink property, right? Because today, private property and state property are not the solution, right? We need something in between, community-based property that is safeguarding the voice of Mother Earth, the voice of future generations, right? The voice of children. So there is a bunch of things that we need to do. Basically, all key categories of economic thought need to be rethought and reframed. And in each of these areas, we already have discussions going on. We have kind of living examples, prototypes, but it's not really put together and it's not really in a more strategic way brought to scale. And I think that's what needs to happen in this decade. There are many, the future is already here. All these things that we need in the future are already present right now. I'm not talking about utopia, not at all. I think
Mhm.
utopia is totally uninteresting, right? Because the future is here, and that's what needs our attention.
Right. So, Otto, I want to ask you a question about your own personal journey as well in the context of all of this, and also feel free to share anything that you see that you're really optimistic about. And even in these fields that you've mentioned in economics, we see Kate Raworth now and the donut economics, which is coming through. We've got mentioned David Sloan Wilson, who's changing the story on what it means to be human from a scientific, evolutionary, biological perspective, that we are orientated for not just compassion, but even altruism, and that altruism a driving force of evolution. It's a very different story to 30 years ago at the selfish gene. So at some point, even changing the narrative is the great work, as Thomas Berry would have called it. But I'm interested because we've all been through such a huge change these last 2 years, this last 18 months. Everything's changed. The way we work, the way we live, our thoughts about what's possible, our thoughts about what's necessary and needed. And as someone of yourself, Otto, who's been on this extraordinary visionary journey for decades, building the work with Theory U and the Presencing Institute and all the other incredible things you have done in your life, I want to ask you, How has the pandemic, or how has this last 18 months? It's much more than just the pandemic, it's everything that's gone with it. How has it transformed you and your vision and your mission and your concept of what's possible and what's needed and what's valuable in the world?
Well, that's a great question, and maybe I can answer with a little story, and then with maybe a conclusion, kind of, or a proposition based on that story. So the story is, so I came over from Europe back here to the US with literally the last flight that came out of on that night out of Europe, and on the return flight and arriving here, kind of, I was struck by, I met some friends from Asia who basically, when they moved from China to Europe, they were like almost as if you in a time machine go back in time, right? And when I kind of moved from Europe here, again, I had this feeling I'm in the time machine. I go backward in time in terms of awareness and consciousness, right? Yeah, towards masks and all these things. And so I wrote a little blog, and at the end of that blog, kind of based on discussions in our team with the Presencing Institute, there was a suggestion, and basically the blog basically said, look, kind of, this is a big thing, kind of, this is kind of what we have been moving towards anyway, one way or another. And this is a disruption that's not only a problem, but it's an opportunity. Because whenever you live through a moment of disruption, you have a choice. And the choice is to turning away, right? And basically in your consciousness, move backwards in time, right? So it's like, that's kind of the move of denial, right? You're not, or you can turn towards. When you turn towards, it requires you to go through a threshold of letting go and letting come. Mm-hmm. And the threshold of letting go is, letting go of what is the question, right? And the answer is everything that's not essential, right? It's like kind of the eye of the needle, right? Which was a gate in the ancient Jerusalem, kind of, where in order to pass through, when you arrived at night hour, the camel had to kneel down. And in order to get through to the inside, you had to take off all the bundles, all the material possessions you took with you, right? So that was the only way to get in. So everything that's not essential, we need to let go. And that allows us, right, to that, then on the other side of that process, to connect with letting come. So first you need to empty your cup, and then something new can arrive and can become present. So that's that was basically, so what at the end of that blog, what we basically said is, look, this is an opportunity for us to reimagine and reshape our path forward, not only as individuals, but also collectively, on a collective level. What does it mean for our community? What does it mean for our society? What does it mean for our civilization? Let's get together, right? And, and create a space of listening where we inquire into that question. What is it we need to let go of? And what is it that's really wanting to emerge? So that was the blog. That was the most read thing I ever wrote. And within 12 days, we had the first session scheduled. We had 100 volunteers for holding groups in 8 or 9 different languages. And over the next 3 months, 15,000 people participated in, joining these sessions. And really, so we didn't do anything complicated, just kind of holding the space for this inquiry. What is it we need to let go of? And what is it really that's wanting to emerge? And how can we reimagine and reshape our path forward? And so that was like a really interesting experience for me. So that if and my takeaway is this: if you happen to be in a moment of disruption and you happen to ask the right kind of question, there's nothing complicated you need to do. You just need to hold the space. And when you hold the space, the right people will show up, and then they, with each other, kind of will co-hold the space. And what's emerging is actually quite significant, and is the guidance kind of for the next step. And in our case, some of the next steps. So it turns out some of the participants came from the UN institutions, and they said, "Look, this was wonderful. Can we do something like this for the UN, right? Such a dialogue series over the summer." Okay, so as you remember, no one was traveling back then. So yeah, there was nowhere to go. Sure, we can do this. And it's actually easy to do it. It's not a big effort. So we did that over the summer months, some of these sessions. And again, so the first thing, we called this series GAIA. And GAIA is an acronym for Global Activation of Intention and Action. So that GAIA series led to something inside the UN that no longer was called GAIA, but it was based on the same principles. And well, there my experience was that, again, kind of we were just holding the space, and holding the space really for this generative dialogue and inquiry, right? Using mindfulness, intentional stillness, using social arts, and really kind of connecting with the deeper resonance. Because my belief is, in my life experience, is you don't need to preach everything that people need to do and so on. Why not? Because it's already there. It's already in their soul. It's already in the more subtle aspect of their experience. What's missing is paying attention to that and attending, focusing our listening to the deeper layers of our experience, both the individual experience, but also the collective experience. And particularly in a moment of disruption like COVID, that is something significant to do, but it's every single day it's significant. So we did that in the UN context, and it had a similar transformative impact that was really surprising for everyone, including myself, because in the old days, if you ask kind of to change makers or the professionals, if you want transformation, well, it takes forever, it's painful, and this and that. I mean, it's like huge effort, right? So that's the normal answer. But my experience is something different, which is when you happen to live in a moment of disruption, so there's very little you need to do. You need to create this holding space. And then because people are already prepared for this moment, they already on a collective level are experiencing the letting go and are wondering about the letting come. And therefore, if you hold the space for this deeper inquiry, where you can shift the collective attention, the collective consciousness, the collective inquiry to these deeper questions, a lot can happen in a really short amount of time. So that was my experience there, and that led then throughout last year, really, and we are just completing the cycle, to a multi-month action learning lab and multiple SDG labs that again kind of brought this deeper, I would say, awareness and impulse for transformative change more into the everyday reality of the institutional transformation that in some ways is already talked about, but often is just a concept and not yet really happening. But with these deeper processes and holding spaces for change is more likely to bridge the knowing doing gap. Because, in the world today, we know everything we need to do, right? To bridge to reach the 1.5 Celsius degree target for the Paris Agreement. So all these solutions are known. The technologies are there. Are we doing it? No. What's missing? Political will and the capacity to bridge the knowing doing gap. So we know one thing, we do something else. And if you have a system, right, where on a collective level, what we know here and what our hand does are separate, are two different things. How do you transform? How do you bridge that gap? Well, by addressing what's in the middle, right? And that's the knowing of the heart. So you cannot bridge the knowing doing gap, the decoupling of head and hand, without activating the knowing of the heart. And activating the knowing of the heart on the level of the collective requires new methodologies, new tools for change that, in essence, do something very simple, which is making the system sense and see itself. So, and the sensing is really important because it's not only a reflection, but if I'm not feeling the pain of the other, then on a collective level, we are very unlikely to unlock the true sources of collective creativity and of co-creativity. So that's where really our main focus is right now, to provide these tools, these methods and tools, because there's no shortage of people with good intention. There's no shortage of people who know that we are moving in the wrong direction. But what we are often missing is the methods and tools that allow us on the level of the collective to bridge the knowing doing gap, to making the system sense and see itself. And that's, where I think we can do a lot. We have tested all these things, and they are working on a small scale. They're also working on a larger scale. And that's why I am personally I'm trying to avoid the word optimistic. I would say maybe hopeful, because I think I don't want to be optimistic, like I just hope for the better outcome. I think so here's the better word, confident. I'm confident in our capacity to really turn this situation around, because that's kind of the true resilience of the human spirit, right? That's how the human spirit works. So if you look at how we work as humans, we basically screw everything up first, right? Then become aware. And then in this waking up moment, we have the capacity to transform the way we are enacting these realities. And that's exactly what's happening now. And that's exactly where, in principle, we can do anything. And personally, I believe the biggest superpower in the world in this century is not the US, is not China, is not any other country, but it is our capacity to activate awareness-based collective action. As humans, to come together and to put our awareness together on some of the key issues. And when we do it, transform the patterns of our behavior. And we saw that in COVID. The moment we do that, we can bend the curve, we can flatten the curve, we can transform the way we enact collective patterns. And what we need to do now is to apply the same single focus, right, on also on the other key issues that we face in this decade and this century, which have to do with the 3 divides.
Extraordinary, Otto. It's amazing to be in the presence of such a brilliant philosopher and educator who has got such a profound structures for this. It's interesting because this is the second time we've done World Unity Week, and definitely we did it last year. So much emerged during the shutdown and the pandemic. But awareness-based collective activity, our theme when we began was answering the call, and it was really this sort of mythical beginning of the hero's journey, the collective hero's journey that we're on. And then this year it was like, no, well, let's do something. So our theme was let's do something. And we're really highlighting incredible organizations and activism right around the world, from what EcoPeace is doing in the Middle East with ecological peace building for nearly 3 decades, and their incredible work, to Purpose Earth, our primary sponsor, who are funding community groups from Africa and India and all over the world that are coming together around certain purpose and passionate areas. It's all about doing something. And then we sat down with a couple of days ago with Vandana Shiva, and she actually reframed all of it with her do nothing revolution. She said, no, it's do nothing. Allow life to come and to flow. And it's not that we need to do more, we need to do less. And so what you've just shared there about presencing and authentic inquiry as a response and as a way through this portal that we are in you say it seems very resonant with what Vandana Shiva was saying as well. So, in our last few moments together, Otto, we have here in World Unity Week something rather extraordinary. It's a collection of 300, 400 organizations that have come together, groups, institutions, and it is, I would say, interestingly diverse. We do have indigenous, a very strong indigenous connection and components. We've got faith-based, we've got environmental groups, we've got activists, it's academics, scientists. I mean, it's a seed of wholeness. So to your point before of saying that the challenge that we face is how to connect all of these different spaces. We're not there yet. It exists in potential and it exists in reality, and yet how do we advance it? So Anna Marie from the Hague Center for Global Governance, one of our co-producers, has put a question in the chat about how can we go forward from here? What you were just speaking about with that program, and I think Priya was putting it there in the chat. By the way, there's quite a few questions about the methodology and the research, and maybe if one of your team would put some links in the chat, that would be helpful. But for our final moments, how can we continue to weave? How can World Unity Week, as we go from year to year, and not just that, but in between, and the community of organizations that have come together, how can we be a part of what you're doing? How can you be a part of what we're doing? How can we better coordinate and collaborate and connect as we go forward on this common journey?
Well, I would love to have that conversation really much more extensively than in the remaining just in the remaining 5 minutes here, because I truly believe kind of that's the only way kind of really to partner with organizations like yourself, with Vandana Shiva, with all the other carriers of this new consciousness that we already seen up, and some of them are connected with grassroots movements, some of them are kind of more inside kind of some of the older institutions that also need to change. Mm-hmm. And so I truly believe that we live in a moment where, and I had being one of the people who has been actually coming around and going across places for really kind of for the last decade plus quite extensively. I really had the distinct feeling and the distinct experience that we are, particularly as we are coming to the end of the last decade and to the beginning of this one, that we live in a time where we see the rise of a new global movement that is already showing up in so many places and that is not aware of itself, right? Because most people really, and that was, and I think you do something quite similar than what we do, kind of, which is, creating these bigger holding spaces and then allowing kind of all these different voices, creating kind of different spaces of reflection, of connection, and allowing all the different parts of the movement becoming visible to each other. And I think that's what you do so beautiful with this week. And so we are very much connected. I think we are just natural allies in what we do. And we would love, including with Priya and Rachel and others, really deepen this conversation, how we can partner more and more intentionally going forward, because that's the only way. Kind of, we all are part of a movement that is much bigger than the piece any of us is holding, and any of our institutions are holding. And so that requires, that's really what I mean with this ecosystem awareness, that you are not just operating from the awareness that the piece that you already have, but really from the awareness of what is wanting to emerge through us. So we will love to have this conversation in terms of direct follow-up. I think the one thing I want to, or two things maybe I want to point to is the at the Presencing Institute website. So it's presencing.org. Or if you just go to my own homepage, ottoscharmer.com, you also see a link to that if you have spelling issues with Presencing. But if you go to the presencing.org website, you see a lot of resources there, many of the ongoing projects. We have a year-round offering really for the global commons, kind of really kind of for movement activation. And what we try to do is to offer the methods and tools that I talked about for organizations and communities to sense and see themselves, and to help multi-stakeholder groups to really go through this shift of awareness from ego to eco, or from silo to systems view. And so you find that in part in the Presenting Institute website, but you find that also in free online course offerings. That the ULab kind of, there's an introductory course in fall each year, which it's kind of operated out of MIT here. And then there is something for teams in the spring term as a result of that, where kind of we create an ecosystem really of change teams, kind of so little kind of initiatives that try to advance really the new civilizational model that we know. We know kind of something is dying. That's an old civilization based on materialism and all the other things. And a new one is being born, and that's what we need to support and create a supporting infrastructure for. So we would love to have this conversation with you guys, and to really be more specific in how we can support each other. Just as an example of the many collaborations that need to form now, if we really want to rise to the occasion that we can only rise together towards.
Magnificent, Otto. And just want to thank Priya for bringing us together. Thank you, Priya. And I wanted to ask Brother John Raymer, the brilliant John Raymer, just to give you our thanks on behalf of World Unity Week, as we know you've got to run to another long meeting. But John, it'd be great just to have you thank Otto Scharmer for being with us in World Unity Week.
Otto, we'll never forget this. In fact, we've got a decade to live it out together. How we steward our global collective behavior. This is the edge, and your clarity is confidence building. It really is. I know many of my brothers and sisters here are shaking their heads and saying, this is just what we needed to hear. Thank you for not only the incredible work you've done, but for your receptivity and openness to figure this out together. I mean, we'll never forget this. This was clearly a turning point.
Thank you, Otto. Thank you, John. Thank you, Priya. Thank you for being with us in World Unity Week, and good luck with your next call, and we'll see you again.
Thank you all, and wish you all the best kind of for the remainder of the journey.